welcome to my next video in this series about breathing and the lungs, and today we're going to be looking at how breathing is controlled. So what we're going to look at today is how your breathing is controlled and how your breathing rate can change in response to the level of exercise or to the situation you're in. So you've all probably been aware that when you've been running you tend to breathe harder, and that's not something that you consciously do, like you'd consciously catch a ball, so you'd have to contract certain muscles. You just tend to speed up your breathing tends to get heavier without having to think about it, a bit like how your heart rate speeds up in response to exercise. And it's an autonomic response, and the way in which it works is, or what it's driven by, is the levels of CO2 within your blood. And so it's the levels of CO2 that actually drive this mechanism. So the CO2 attached to your red blood cells, and so when you're respiring and you're exercising, you would expect to respire more, and hence you'd have more CO2 found within the blood. And what happens is this is picked up by a set of receptors called some chemoreceptors, and they just detect chemical changes within the blood, and that can be something to do with your CO2 levels. It can be to do with different types of chemicals. In this case, it can actually measure the pH, and so carbon dioxide is slightly acidic, and therefore the blood pH will actually drop, and this is what these chemoreceptors will detect. The chemoreceptors then send a message to a specific centre of the brain, and it's a centre of the brain called the Medulla Oblongata, which is this section within the brain. And it's to the sympathetic sector, and what that means by sympathetic, that's the speed up section. The slow down section is called parasympathetic. That then relays a message down a sympathetic nerve, and then that takes that to the muscles that control breathing, so the diaphragm and the ribs, which basically gets them to contract more frequently, and so you end up breathing quicker. Now if you look at the converse, what would happen if you had low levels of CO2? So with a low level of CO2, you therefore would not be respiring as quickly, and therefore there'd be less carbon dioxide levels. And so this diagram shows basically the same as the last one, except this time there's not much CO2 present. And it's very much the same. The chemoreceptors, they'll detect usually a rise in the pH, and therefore that will send a message to this parasympathetic sector of the brain. This then uses a corresponding neuron, a parasympathetic nerve cell, which again sends a message to the muscles controlling breathing to slow down. And so it's a two-way street with this. You've got a method to speed up and to slow down. So in summary, what can happen when your levels of CO2 change? The chemoreceptors pick these up, and these take this to the respiratory centre or the medulla, and these can either increase or decrease breathing. So in the case of high levels of CO2, this will stimulate the sympathetic sector of the medulla, and therefore the breathing will speed up. If you have low levels of CO2, this will stimulate the parasympathetic respiratory centre, and therefore the breathing will slow down.